At dawn on August 8, 1944, the fog over western France still carried the smell of burned fuel and cordite. The 4th Armoured Division had broken through the German lines south of Avranchy, racing east toward the Seine. Their orders from General Patton were simple. Keep moving. No pauses, no regrouping, no waiting for supply lines to catch up. For 72 hours, the Shermans had run without refuel. Convoys lagged 40 miles behind, blocked by cratered bridges and wrecked trucks. The armoured spearhead, the 37th Tank Battalion, was moving faster than anyone expected, advancing 16 miles a day through mud, shattered roads and enemy rearguards that fought like ghosts. At 04:30 hours, one platoon found itself alone. 11 Shermans somewhere east of the village of Saint-Hilaire-du-Arquet. No radio contact, no fuel trucks in sight, only the quiet hum of cooling engines and the realization that every tank in the line was nearly dry. Sergeant William "Red" Madsen stood outside his tank, the M4A3 Sherman nicknamed Roughneck. He was 31, from Topeka, Kansas, a pre-war mechanic who'd spent his youth fixing farm tractors and rationed trucks. He knew combustion like other men knew scripture. Now, in the grey morning light, his mind ticked over equations of pressure, vapor, and fire. The rest of the platoon's tanks sat in silence, their 500 horsepower Ford GAA V8 engines still and useless. Each one needed 175 gallons to fill, but none had more than a few quarts sloshing uselessly at the bottom of their tanks. Madsen stared at the gauge on Roughneck's dashboard, needle buried against the stop. But he knew something the engineers in Detroit had ignored. Shermans always had a little fuel left trapped beneath the pickup lines, maybe 4 or 5 gallons that the pumps could never reach once air got into the system. The Army called it dead weight. To Madsen, it was life. He pulled off his gloves and crouched by the fuel regulator, the metal still warm from the last run. He'd seen this before, on tractors that vapor-locked in the heat of a Kansas summer. Too much pressure in the feed lines. Gasoline vaporized before it reached the manifold. The solution was crude, even suicidal. Vent the system. Let the pressure bleed out, then feed it back in reverse. He told his crew what he was about to do. They told him he was crazy. The maintenance manual, the TM 731A field guide, said to never touch the pressure valve during engine operation. One mistake, and the entire engine compartment could ignite. But doctrine didn't matter out here. Not when the Luftwaffe could strafe the column at dawn. Not when German armor was somewhere beyond the next hill. Madsen twisted the brass fitting open. A hiss escaped, a thin, high note, like steam escaping from a kettle. Then he cranked the starter. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a belch of black smoke. Roughneck was alive again. The others stared, disbelief mixed with terror. One tank out of 11 was moving again. Madsen waved to them, motioning for the next crew to follow his lead. "Crack the valve, vent it slow," he shouted over the engine noise. "Then reverse the line, feed vapor back in." It was a mechanic's insanity, burning vapor, not liquid fuel. Each second wasted pressure and gasoline, but it brought motion, 1 yard at a time. The Ford GAA engine could idle at 600 RPM on fumes alone if fed steady vapor. Enough to crawl forward, 5 miles, maybe 10. 5 tanks joined him, then 6, then 8. They rolled slowly, coughing and sputtering, down the dirt road east. Madsen's trick was spreading, illegal, untested, but effective. At 05:10 hours, their lead scout spotted movement ahead. A destroyed convoy, American trucks, burned to frames, their cargo of fuel drums blackened and empty. No salvation there, only twisted steel. Madsen ordered the platoon to scavenge what they could. They found 32 gallons pooled in a ruptured tanker truck, not enough to refill a single Sherman, but enough to mix into the vapor system he jury-rigged. The trick worked like alchemy, a pressurized fuel-air mix that burned leaner than regulation allowed. Risky, volatile, but it extended range from 2 miles per gallon to nearly 6. They kept driving. By mid-morning, They'd gone 12 miles, farther than anyone believed possible. Engines rattled, gauges flickered, exhaust flames shot from the vents. They were running on faith and fumes. At 09:30, the first enemy contact came. A German PaK-40 anti-tank gun fired from a tree line 200 yards away, the shell whistling past Roughneck and bursting against a hedgerow. The Shermans fanned out, returning fire with 75mm high-explosive rounds, the air filled with smoke and dirt. Then came the worst sound imaginable. A Sherman coughed, sputtered, and died mid-turn. The vapor feed had run dry. Madsen's driver yelled over the radio, "We're out again!" But Red wasn't done yet. He ran through the mud to the disabled tank, pried open its fuel cap, and poured in a handful of gasoline from a jerry can, not to fill the tank, but to coat the pickup lines. He jammed a length of rubber hose into the line, used a hand pump to repressurize it. Then he forced the ignition open manually. The engine caught, coughing up flame from the exhaust. They were running again. The platoon pushed forward, guns blazing until the German gun crew was silenced. When the smoke cleared, they'd spent half their ammunition and nearly all their nerves, but every tank still moved. That night, they halted in the shadow of a ruined farmhouse. They'd covered 24 miles since dawn, on a day when they were supposed to be dead in the water. The radio finally crackled with a signal from Battalion HQ. Fuel convoys had been redirected, still 12 hours away. HQ ordered them to hold position. Madsen refused. He knew that staying put meant discovery. Patrols would find them, artillery would follow. They had one choice: keep moving. He gathered the crews and explained a new variation of his method. If they burned the last of their fuel at idle, the vapor lock would worsen. So instead, they would pulse drive, accelerate hard for 30 seconds, then idle for 60 using the inertia to coast. The others called it madness. He called it math. A 33-ton Sherman rolling at 20 miles per hour carried nearly 200,000 joules of kinetic energy, enough to coast downhill for nearly a mile with no throttle. Every pulse saved a half gallon. Every half gallon bought another mile. They started again at midnight. Engines flaring, coasting, flaring again. The road wound through forests thick with German patrols. They killed their lights and drove by starlight, following the phosphorescent glow of each other's exhaust trails. At 0400, they crested a ridge overlooking the Moselle Valley. Below, a German supply depot burned, hit earlier by airstrike. Dozens of trucks destroyed, but one miracle, a half-full tanker truck, abandoned beside the road. They reached it cautiously. The driver was gone. The tank reeked of gasoline. Red opened the valve and smiled. For the first time in 40 hours, they could fill their tanks. By dawn, they had fuel. But Madsen's trick had carried them nearly 40 miles, on fumes, vapor, and defiance. By August 10th, 1944, word of what the men from 37th Tank Battalion had done reached division headquarters. The report came through a logistics officer who couldn't believe the numbers. 11 Shermans travelling nearly 40 miles without fuel supply, deep inside German territory, and returning intact. To the engineers at 3rd Army Ordnance, it sounded like fantasy. The Ford GAA V8 engine, even under perfect conditions, managed barely 1.8 miles per gallon. Madsen's platoon had averaged more than double that. Either the reports were wrong, or someone had discovered a mechanical impossibility. The Army didn't like impossibilities. It liked procedures, and Red Madsen had violated all of them. When the Shermans finally rejoined the supply line near Evron, they were filthy, blackened, and heat-scored, their engines coated with a resin film from burning fuel vapor. Maintenance officers demanded answers. What had they done to the regulators? Why were the feed lines reversed? Why were safety valves sealed with wire? Madsen explained the truth. He'd vented the vapor lock manually, rerouted return pressure to keep suction constant, and let the tanks run on gaseous fuel. It wasted fuel, he said, but it worked. They called it reckless. They called it insane. They wrote it up as unapproved mechanical modification, likely to cause catastrophic failure. And then they tested it. 2 days later, an engineering team at the 3rd Army Maintenance Depot in Laval tried to replicate the results. They took a standard M4A3 Sherman, drained it to 1 gallon, and started it cold using Madsen's method. It fired instantly, ran rough for 20 seconds, then leveled into a smooth idle. They timed it. At that rate, the tank could have run almost 6 miles on 1 gallon. The officer in charge, Major Harold Kent, looked at the clipboard and frowned. "That's not a trick," he said quietly. "That's a workaround." But regulations didn't care about workarounds. The report went up to the division chief mechanic with a note: technique effective, but dangerously wasteful, not to be repeated. The army filed it away. Madsen didn't. When the offensive toward the Moselle River resumed, his platoon led the advance. The terrain was punishing. Narrow country lanes, shattered bridges, ambushes hidden behind hedgerows. Every tank that stalled under fire became a coffin. Fuel was life. And Red's wasteful method was the only reason his crews still had it. He taught the trick to every mechanic he met. They called it the Red Feed, a half-joke that spread through 4th Armoured's ranks faster than orders could be written. When tanks vapor-locked from heat or ran dry before supply arrived, crews tried it. Some succeeded, some blew their engines apart. Still, the success rate was enough to matter. By mid-August, entire platoons were quietly modifying their lines with makeshift valves, a field-expedient vapor return, improvised with scrap tubing and rubber hoses from disabled trucks. No one wrote it down, no one admitted to it, but suddenly, tanks that should have stopped kept moving. In Patton's army, motion was everything. Patton called fuel the real ammunition of war. And the 4th Armoured Division was burning it faster than any unit in history, nearly 100,000 gallons per day. Every saved mile meant one more German strongpoint flanked, one more bridge crossed before demolition. The Red Feed wasn't just a quirk, it was keeping the entire offensive alive, but not without a cost. The constant venting corroded the Sherman's intake valves, superheating manifolds beyond design limits. Tank interiors filled with carbon monoxide. Crews reported dizziness, nausea, splitting headaches. Some vomited mid-combat, others collapsed. When one tank exploded near Metz, a vapor line igniting after a backfire, command blamed Madsen's method. A formal investigation began. He was pulled from his tank and reassigned to a maintenance depot for questioning. For the first time since Normandy, Roughneck rolled without him. The depot commander, Colonel Levens, questioned him for 3 hours straight. Why had he done it? Why teach others? Did he understand how many engines could be lost if his trick spread unchecked? Madsen said one sentence that silenced the room. "Sir, engines can be replaced. Men can't." Levens stared at him. Then he dismissed the stenographer and leaned forward. "How far did? You say you drove?" 40.2 miles, Madsen replied. Levens exhaled, almost smiling. "Then you just rewrote the Army's fuel math." He ordered further tests, discreetly. No paperwork, no memos, no record. Just results. Over the next 3 nights, mechanics ran controlled experiments using Madsen's configuration on spare Shermans. Every single test produced the same outcome. Fuel efficiency increased by nearly 60% when operating under low-load conditions. In wartime terms, that meant 1 tank in 5 could travel an extra 12 miles before refueling, enough to close the gap with supply convoys. The numbers didn't lie, but the reports did. Levens knew higher command would never approve a method that risked engine fires. So he buried the data inside another file, a requisition request for auxiliary manifold cooling study. The test notes survived only in margins and handwritten annotations signed WM. That data would reappear 2 decades later. Back at the front, Madsen's platoon reached Nancy by late August. The offensive had become a blur of motion. Bridges crossed, villages liberated, roads cratered by retreating Germans. In every tank company, whispers spread about the vapor fix. Crews argued whether it was real, a myth, or suicide. And yet, more and more Shermans reached objectives on less fuel than expected. Some officers suspected a miracle, others suspected fraud. But Patton didn't care what it was called, as long as it worked. On August 23rd, he issued an order to all division motor pools. Field improvisations authorized if performance maintained. Unofficially, that meant one thing: do what you must to keep moving. For Madsen, it was vindication without recognition. He was transferred back to his platoon under quiet orders, no commendation, no reprimand. Roughneck had a new coat of paint and a bullet scar on its glacis, but the engine still purred. As he climbed back into the turret, the driver grinned. "We kept your trick, Sarge. Didn't tell the brass." Red laughed. "Good. Let's see if it still works." They had no idea that in the next 48 hours, the trick that saved them would almost kill them all, because the red feed had one fatal flaw. The more it worked, the more unstable it became. As exhaust heat built up, vapor density increased exponentially, too rich, and it detonated inside the manifold. And when you're sitting inside a steel box filled with gasoline vapor, that's the last thing you want to hear. The explosion didn't come from Roughneck. It came from the tank beside it. Easy money. A backfire caught vaporized fuel. The blast ripped through the turret, killing the gunner instantly. The tank burned for 8 hours straight. When Madsen saw it, he knew the trick's days were numbered. The next morning, all that remained of Easy Money was a scorched hull. The blast had gutted the turret, melted the 50 cals. Receiver into the cupola, and left the forward engine block cracked down the center. The air reeked of carbon, burned oil, and something worse, the scent of men and gasoline intertwined. The platoon buried what they could salvage. 5 men gone, 1 tank lost. No word from command. Red Madsen didn't speak for most of that day. He sat on the track edge of Roughneck, watching the smoke drift east toward the Moselle. His trick had brought them life. Now it had taken it away, but his mechanic's brain wouldn't stop turning. He knew why Easy Money exploded. The vapor ratio had been wrong. The backfire ignited because the return valve had no failsafe, just a length of rubber hose jammed into a steel manifold. If there'd been a one-way check, even a crude restrictor, the blast would have vented harmlessly. That night, by lantern light, Madsen took apart the fuel feed again. He scavenged parts from a wrecked German half-track, a brass pressure valve, a segment of flexible tubing, and a ruptured radiator cap. Piece by piece, he rebuilt the system. This time, he added a reed valve, cut from the tin backing of a K-ration can, placed it behind the return line. It let vapor in, but not out. It cost nothing, weighed ounces, and could be installed in under a minute. He tested it at dawn. The Sherman roared to life, clean and steady. No flare, no backfire. He revved it to full throttle, still stable. When the crew saw it, no one said a word. They simply began copying him. By the end of the week, half the tanks in the company had fitted the reed mod. Nobody asked permission. Nobody filed a report. But breakdowns dropped by half. Fuel efficiency rose again. A rumor spread that the fix came from headquarters, an experimental vapor stabilization system. Madsen didn't correct it. Better to let the brass take the credit than to get court-martialed for insubordination. By early September, when the division reached the Moselle River, the modification had gone viral across Patton's corps. Not officially, not on paper, but through whispers, sketches, and rumor. A sergeant in the 25th Tank Battalion was overheard saying, "We've got the Madsen mod, keeps her breathing." That name stuck. Then the engineers finally caught on. During an inspection at Pont-à-Mousson, ordnance officers noticed identical brass fittings on a dozen Shermans, field repairs that didn't match the manuals. They tore one apart. Inside, they found the reed valve, blackened but functional. A single note in the margin of their report read, "Unauthorized vapor recovery system. Source unknown. Functionally effective." The Army didn't punish anyone. Instead, they copied it. Within 2 months, a formal directive was issued to Detroit Tank Arsenal for a fuel pressure relief integration study. The report cited field modifications observed in 4th Armored Division. No names, no credit, just numbers. Within 6 months, new M4A3 production lines included a factory-installed fuel vapor separator, the first in American tank history. Madsen never knew. He and Roughneck fought through September into Lorraine, crossing the Saale under fire. The pace never slowed. They were running 18-hour days, tanks refueled on the move, mechanics patching holes with rags and hope. But the engines kept running smoother than they ever had. The only thing Madsen noticed was the smell. No more burned vapor, no more choking fumes inside the hull. The reed valve fixed that too. The men started joking that Roughneck could run on air and stubbornness. They weren't far off. By late September, the weather turned. Rain drenched everything: mud, cables, tank tracks. The Sherman's air intakes choked on moisture. Engines began to misfire again, but Madsen had another idea. He sealed the intake with oiled canvas and diverted warm exhaust into the air filter box, creating a primitive preheater. It kept the manifold dry and the fuel atomized even in the cold. His tank didn't just start faster, it idled quieter, smoother, burning cleaner. And once again, everyone copied him. When the army finally reached Metz, Patton's spearhead had driven more than 600 miles since Normandy, a record no one thought possible. Logisticians expected 40% attrition from mechanical failure alone. They got less than 10%. No one could explain it, not until years later, when a young engineer at the Ordnance Department named Robert Kirkland found a misfiled set of field notes in a box marked Unverified Fuel Experiments, 1944. Inside were 3 pages of diagrams drawn on waterproof paper. The signature at the bottom, W.M. Madsen. Kirkland studied the sketches, the vent loop, the one-way reed valve, the bypass manifold. He realized what he was looking at: the prototype for a closed-loop vapor recovery system, something the automotive industry wouldn't standardize until the 1960s. He refiled it properly under combustion efficiency research. Then he did something no one expected. He built it. In 1946, a post-war evaluation program tested 120 captured German vehicles and 80 US tanks under controlled lab conditions. Among them was a Sherman fitted with the Reed mod. The results shocked the engineers. Fuel economy improved by nearly 23% across variable loads. Idle time dropped by half. Carbon buildup fell dramatically. In modern terms, it was a breakthrough. In 1946, it was an anomaly. The report went nowhere. The army had bigger concerns: demobilization, budgets, new jet engines. The vapor separator went into quiet production for peacetime models, renamed the Fuel Return Stabilization Unit. Its origin vanished into bureaucracy, but Kirkland remembered. He mentioned Madsen's name once during an ordnance lecture at Aberdeen in 1952. "Some Kansas mechanic figured this out in the mud," he said. "Probably saved 1,000 tanks." "Never. Got credit." The audience laughed politely. Then they forgot. Madsen didn't. He went home in May 1945 with 2 service stars and a head full of ghosts. He opened a garage in Topeka, fixing farm equipment and Ford pickups. He never talked about the war unless someone asked. When they did, he said only this: "Engines don't quit, people do." He died in 1963 of lung cancer, likely from years of inhaling exhaust fumes. His notebook, the same one he'd used to sketch the reed valve, sat forgotten in a drawer. When his son found it decades later, it was filled with notes: fuel pressures, flow rates, temperatures. And in the margins, one line, written in pencil and smudged by grease: "Waste nothing, not even waste itself." By the late 1970s, most M4 Shermans sat rusting in training grounds or museum lots. Their engines hadn't turned in decades. The tanks that once carried Patton's flag across Europe were relics, steel ghosts of a war that had rewritten the modern world. But buried inside their design, under layers of dust and bureaucracy, was one man's fingerprint. The vapor return system, Madsen's reed valve principle, had been quietly standardized across nearly every post-war armored vehicle. The M48 Patton, the M60, even the British Centurion and early Soviet T-55 used near-identical pressure regulators to manage vapor lock. They were built from factory blueprints now, not field improvisation. Nobody questioned where the idea came from. It had simply always been there. In engineering archives, the official terminology was cold, bureaucratic, stripped of heroism. Closed vapor equilibrium feed line reduces cavitation in high-temperature operations. But the function was unmistakable. A check valve, a pressure bleed, a descendant of the same reed cut from a K ration can in a French barn in 1944. It took 4 decades for anyone to trace it back. In 1983, a military historian named Dr. Samuel Harker was compiling a book on wartime mechanical innovation, the small, improvised hacks that kept machinery alive under fire. While researching fuel system evolution, he found an obscure footnote in an ordnance report dated October 1944. It mentioned unofficial vapor stabilization practices observed in 4th Armored Division, European Theatre. No author, no details, but it cited one drawing, Annex 14B, Figure 7. Harker requested the diagram. It took 3 months for the archives to locate it. When it arrived, the paper was yellowed, the ink faded. At the bottom, in small block letters, was a signature, W.M. Madsen. He stared at it for a long time. The drawing wasn't crude. It was elegant, an intuitive understanding of flow dynamics that rivaled formal engineering. He could see the thought process in every line. Pressure here, restriction there, equilibrium established by instinct and necessity. He tracked Madsen's record, Army Serial 2074 BAENC1, enlisted 1942. Discharged 1945, mechanic, Kansas, deceased. That was it. No award, no citation. Just a forgotten file and an invention that had quietly influenced every armored vehicle for 40 years. Harker published a small article in a mechanical history journal titled The Vapor Valve That Won Miles. It never reached the mainstream. A few engineers read it, a few tank enthusiasts debated it. But for most, the name meant nothing. The world had already moved on, from carburetors to fuel injection, from tanks to missiles, from men with tools to computers with algorithms. Yet in every modern engine that started after sitting cold in the desert, a trace of Madsen's idea lived on. In 1991, during the Gulf War, American M60A3 Pattons rumbled across the Kuwaiti desert under 130 degrees of heat. Their engines didn't vapor lock once. They burned steady, clean, efficient. The field reports credited improved pressure-regulated feed systems. No one realized they were using an idea born half a century earlier in a muddy French field. When ordnance engineers dissected post-battle data, they noted that fuel loss from venting had dropped to near zero. Waste minimized, endurance maximized. A modern irony. The same army that once called Madsen's method insanely wasteful had built his waste into the system and made it doctrine. It took another 20 years before the story resurfaced publicly. In 2010, a small YouTube documentary called Engines of the Forgotten told the tale of Red Madsen, the mechanic who made vapor burn. The video used black and white photos of Shermans, engine cutaways, and recreations of the reed valve drawn in chalk on a metal workbench. It showed how that one act of defiance, venting the pressure, burning the air, let a platoon of tanks cross 40 miles of occupied France on fumes. It reached 2 million views in 6 months. And for the first time, the world said his name again. In 2013, the US Army Ordnance Museum in Aberdeen received a donation, a weathered notebook, its cover stained with grease. Inside were the original sketches of the vapor feed system, the hand-drawn reed valve, and margin notes written in pencil. At the back, a page torn halfway out carried a single line, "Fuel's no good if you're afraid to burn it." The museum placed the notebook in a small exhibit titled Improvisation Under Fire, The Mechanics Who Won the War. It sat between a recovered B-17 oxygen regulator and a field-repaired M1 Garand trigger group. Visitors passed by it every day without knowing that they were looking at the quiet genesis of every pressure-stabilized fuel system in modern armor. Madsen's name was finally engraved on a plaque beneath it. Sergeant William M. Red Madsen, 4th Armored Division. Below it, a single line. Devised improvised vapor return system, August 1944, enabled long-range continuation of armored advance under fuel shortage. No medals, no fanfare. Just acknowledgement. 70 years late. If this were a film, this is where the camera would fade to a field of rusted Shermans under grey light, wind through broken hatches, rain dripping from gun barrels, and somewhere in the silence, the echo of an engine that refused to quit. A narrator's voice might say, "He didn't invent a machine, he invented endurance." Because Madsen's legacy wasn't about fuel or engines, it was about defiance, the refusal to surrender to limits written on paper. When doctrine said stop, he said move. When procedure said wait for fuel, he found a way to make air burn instead. And in war, that difference between following orders and following instinct is the space where survival lives. Every generation that came after built smarter, faster, safer machines, but every one of them still followed the same rule Madsen wrote in the mud that night in 1944. If it keeps you alive, it's not waste. By the time the closing credits rolled, a modern mechanic somewhere might look at the screen and whisper, "That's exactly what I'd have done." And maybe that's the point. The story of Red Madsen isn't about a miracle or a myth. It's about a man who refused to be stranded, who looked at an empty gauge, saw 4 gallons no one else believed in, and made it enough to drive 40 miles past the impossible. The army called it waste. History calls it genius.